I'd like to welcome you.
That really does work. Wow.
I got your attention. Technology, it's everything. Welcome. Welcome to Virginia Seminary. Welcome to our spring taste of the evening school, the place of honor class in our society today. I am Lisa Kimball. I am the Associate Dean for Lifelong Learning at Virginia Seminary and a Professor of Christian Formation and Congregational Leadership. And it is my honor to welcome you and to oversee all those little parts of the seminary that are committed to continuing education, lifelong learning. So the Taste of the Evening School, for those of you who may not have attended before, is a concept of a one-night fall and one-night spring gathering to give you and others of you online, which we're delighted to have you with us tonight, a taste of what it is we try to do in continuing education at this seminary. And our evening school is varied, but the dimensions of it are consistent, which is that it is an opportunity for you as a learner to participate in critical thinking about critical issues through a theological lens. So it's a time for you to bring your interests as an individual, as an adult in the world, making your way into conversation with the theological tradition. And these tastes of the evening school are nights that we try to surface some kind of critical issue on behalf of the wider conversation with the public society. So our fall taste of the evening school, which Dr. Gail Fisher-Stewart addressed, spoke to the critical issue of race in our society. And this is the second part of that sort of inseparable pair, speaking to the critical issue of class, the often silent issue of class in our society. I don't need to remind you the week that we are in. I do not need to remind you that we are 2 days from the peaceful transfer of power and the inauguration of our, give me the number president? 45th President of the United States. I also do not need to remind you that this has been a particularly contentious and divisive season of political competition and fairly aggressive negotiation about what it means to lead this nation. And through that season of divisiveness, through this season of struggle, fractures in our society that have always been there have become so apparent and so profoundly distracting that we, I believe, as people of faith and church, have a moral obligation to face into these critical issues, to find our common voices, to find roots in our traditions, and hope in our beliefs that will take us back out into the world and begin to heal and work toward possibilities for a future of hope for all people. So tonight's conversation is one that is very close to my heart. It is one that I think I cannot, as a Christian, I cannot, as a leader in the church, continue in the work that I am called to do and not faithfully address questions of injustice that surround class. It's a topic that is also very heated. It is a topic that is very sensitive. And I am so delighted that we have 3 people here tonight who are willing to speak from their hearts, who are willing to engage us with their wisdom, their scholarship, their lived experience, and particularly their conviction about the possibility of positive ways forward for our world and particularly for this nation. So we have 3 people who are going to tell their stories in whatever form they choose. I've invited them to introduce themselves to you because I think personal narrative is far more compelling than my reading you a long CV. And I also think it is in their personal narratives that we will hear a common narrative begin to emerge and with which I hope you will begin to engage. We will have time for your questions. I invite you to use the same discretion that our guests will be using, which is to see this as a space of common learning, but also a space of common regard. I invite you to speak carefully, to speak with intention, and to speak in honesty about those dimensions of class that you find tonight to be stirring and that you find our conversation might inform. So with that, I want to invite you to welcome three phenomenal people, all of whom I would actually consider good friends on various different levels of relationship. Amy and I have only met recently. But Dr. Satyana Clark is an ordained priest of the Church of South India. He functions here in the United States within the Episcopal Church. And as your bio is in the papers that you have say, he is a professor at Wesley Seminary. We happen to share life together in a congregation in Washington, D.C., where we both worship and serve, which is the Church of the Epiphany. So Satya and I go back some distance, and I will let him tell you much more about his interest in this particular topic. Dr. Amy Best is our newcomer and best new friend. She is the chair of the Department of Sociology at George Mason. And if anybody did her dissertation on the prom, you know she's cool. So this is someone who thinks deeply about who we are as human beings, how our identities as human beings in public society shape the common life that we live. And I am grateful that you're here to share this with us. And then Mark Jefferson is a very new member of our faculty. He joined us this year as a visiting professor of homiletics. He brings energy, savvy, profound insight to the field of preaching. He's teaching a course on preaching and hip-hop. He's teaching a course that is engaging the popular media and the wired in his homiletical instruction. So we're going to hear some things tonight that might help us all think anew about this critical issue of what it means to be a human being in a society highly divided by class. I welcome you online, and thank you all. So Sati agreed to share first.
I made two decisions. One is not to look at my notes at all. And the other is to stand and walk around. I teach a class between 6:30 and 9:30, and if I sit and teach, my students just gradually think they're in an armchair, and I lose them very quickly. And I can get back to my notes and thoughts that are actually penned down, thinking that I would work with some conceptual concepts. I will not do that. But like part of the Anglican Communion and respecting our Episcopal tradition together, what I'm going to do is spin a couple of stories, get to the scripture, lift up a point from the Bible that deals with issues of poverty, honor, and class. And then I will go to something that all of us know very well and have built some of our theology on, and make a point from baptism. Let me start with a personal story. I was about 15 or 16. This was in South India, in a city called Chennai. It used to be called Madras. My father was a priest, a minister of the Church of South India, who eventually became the bishop in Madras and succeeded somebody that was really well known theologically across the world, a person called Leslie Newbigin. So my father was a larger-than-life figure, and I was, say, about 15 or 16, and we were in high school. So I went off to high school, came back after a long train ride, and then walked. It must have been about 45 minutes train ride, about half an hour of walk, really tired, 3:30 or 4 after school, 2 brothers with me. So all of us were charging back. And we come into our living room, and my father is sitting there with another gentleman who wasn't dressed well at all. Now, I come, for those of you who know the Indian caste system, I come from the 4th rung of the caste community, and he must have come from the untouchable community, the one that has no honor, that live outside the gates, that for a long time were even unapproachable. They were unseeable. You couldn't touch them, right? But the church, of course, opened itself up in the power of the gospel, and eventually Christianity in India is referred to as a pariah religion, because 60 to 70% of the Christians in India are from the untouchable communities, who are now called Dalits. Okay? So this is the honor that I held that I didn't fully know about. My father did. He knew the church. And this was an evangelist who came in, wasn't dressed well, was from a Dalit community. So we all, three of us, just charge in. We say, "Hi, Dad, we've had a lovely day," and run into the dining room where my mother would keep our evening tea. We were tired. We ran in, we started eating our tea. My father came into the dining room, said, "Can you come back?" So the three of us came back. And he said, "Did you see this uncle?" Somebody that we didn't know at all became uncle now suddenly. It's like we know all our uncles and our aunts. This ain't no uncle, right? But this is in front of him. The gentleman sang. He said, "Did you not see this uncle?" We said, "Yes, Dad, but we really wanted to eat something." He said, "You have dishonored this uncle. He's a priest and evangelist like me." And what he did is something that the three of us talk about this till this day. He made the three of us kneel in three corners of the room. Kneel down. Fortunately, this gentleman had a heart of a Christian. He pleaded with my father and said, "These young chaps don't know much." And then, fortunately, my father listened to him. It was probably 4 or 5 minutes. We went, we had to go to him and honor him before we could go and finish our afternoon tea. Now, again, this is where our class caps immediately go on. After I've told the story in different places, lots of people that are embedded in a certain class come and tell me, "Oh, I hope you've seen a psychotherapist. One never recovers from this kind of thing." But the three of us live in 3 different cities in the world. I live in Washington, D.C. Another brother lives in Warwick, just outside of London. And the third brother lives in Melbourne. 3 doing very different things. Every time we come together, we tell ourselves the story and say that wherever we are, the first thing that we seem to do when we enter the room is to see who doesn't have a place of honor and move towards them. Probably we're hearing my Father's voice now from heaven, and then move to the center of the room. I think the church is in need of conversion. The conversion not just towards Jesus, our Lord and Master, but towards the poor and those that we have dishonored, but still bear the image of God, and therefore the mark of honor. So in a lot of ways, I think that I live my life out wanting to bring honor to all those that, without knowing sometimes, but sometimes deliberately, are dishonored and placed by default into a different class. The second is a thought from the Bible. And this is, most of you will know this, Matthew 26, 6 to 16. Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Bethany, one of the interpretations, the house of affliction. Jesus, Simon the leper. And of course, we know the story about the anointing of Jesus' feet. But what remains with me in this particular story is where there's an objection that the ointment could be given to the poor, the money from the ointment could be given to the poor. And Jesus' words, "For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." A lot of us forget that second part. "For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Of course, this is odd. Because you go to Matthew 28, and the last words, in a sense, some of the last words of Jesus is what? "Lo, I am with you always. But you do not have me as me. You have me immersed, incarnated among those that I will teach you about, I will teach you to honor and to serve in Matthew 25. If you have done this to the least of my brothers and sisters. So wherever there is dishonor, there is lessness or leastness. Wherever someone falls off, what we think of is our structures of honor and power, there I am with you always. So another part of who I am as a disciple is to search out where one can bring honor to God so that glory is magnified in all things, God's glory. And where does that come from? That comes from changing our posture, changing our stance that class, race, and caste have created for us to, in many senses, I can speak for myself, to be a stiff-necked representative of my generation and move towards that stance that is a reformation of bending towards places of dishonor so that, yes, the poor are with you always. But Jesus is also with the poor. The Catholics have really put this well, but it's so true of us who also are part of the sacramental theology. The poor are a sacrament of God. It's in touching, in moving towards them, in bending, in being part of bringing honor wherever they are, whoever they may be, that indeed we feel, touch, and taste the body of Christ. I also am learning a lot from breaking the privilege of caste and literally learning that my lot lies with the freedom, the liberation, and the wholeness of Dalit communities and the poor, the despised, and the dishonored. Let me leave this last thought with you. In baptism, there's a certain conversion, a reversal. And I urge you to reclaim that part of your own baptism. In general, we know and we have been taught that blood is thicker than water. Right? That's something that all of us basically have been told. In baptism, in going into the waters with Jesus Christ and coming up as a new man and woman, through that act, water has become thicker than blood. The privileges of your blood, the privileges of the blood that runs with you in class, in honor, all of that is emptied into the baptismal font. And you arise again and say, "O Lord, now the waters of the earth are thicker than blood." And that's why you see Jesus' baptism. He's baptized, he gets up. From that point, he's driven by the Holy Spirit to go about the things of the kingdom. In many ways, kinship, which has to do with blood loyalties, is exchange for the reigning of God, which, as I have said previously, involves seeking honor where we have created structurally dishonor, dejection. Friends, it's a real privilege for me to be here. This is something that comes from my heart. This is something that I seek to live out. And I pray and hope that this will be the journey that I continue in faithfulness to the one that called, freed, and has sent me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sati. So Amy is going to speak next. You're going to hear 3 very distinct narratives of engagement with this critical issue. Be listening, be thinking about which of these approaches to understanding yourself and your own experience of class is particularly provocative. And then we'll begin to have some conversation and engage them across the platform as well as with you. So, Amy.
Well, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. I really appreciate being in a community space to talk about what is a really important set of concerns now perhaps more than ever, although some of the worries that we have now have been sort of in the making for a while. So I'm a sociologist, and most of my work has focused in, am I not loud enough? Okay, let's see if I move this a little closer, if that works. Okay. I'll try and project, too. So, actually, you know what I'm going to do? There we go. Would you like me to stand up? I can stand up. So I'm a sociologist, and most of my work has focused in on the lives of young people in a U.S. context. I study young people in Virginia. I studied young people in New York City and young people in California. And I've been interested in looking at the ways in which the range of social differences come to shape the experiences of being young. When we talk about the teenager, we often talk about it as though that person was a singular person. But in fact, the experiences of being young are profoundly shaped by the range of social differences, but social class is one of them. Social class is sort of messy and tricky to talk about. We don't always have a lot of good tools to understand it. As sociologists, we don't always have a lot of good tools to even measure it. And one of the reasons why that is because most of us have multiple class leanings. And think about your own life experience, and if you were to think about the class to which you would claim, in all likelihood, you'll be able to, if you sort of check back through your family, you could probably identify a range of things. I grew up what I would say is middle class, but it's really upper middle class, and I came from a family of multiple class leanings, like many families in the U.S. Now, one of the reasons why we have multiple class leanings is because we do have mobility in the U.S. People do move in and out of class groups, but we have a lot of folks who stay in their class groups as well. And we love the narratives of mobility. Our current president tells that his narrative, his wife tells that narrative, and it's very, very compelling. But as much as we have mobility, our mobility looks a particular way. It tends not to be the kind of mobility where somebody begins in one place and begins poor and ends rich, but maybe over the course of a generation, they will move in class positions. But our investment in the ideas of class mobility often hide the deep ways in which we often actually stay put. And they often hide for us the ways in which social class gets reproduced from one generation to another, so that middle-class kids grow up to be middle-class adults. Upper middle-class kids do too. And poor kids usually grow up to be poor adults. And we live in a cultural context where inequality is very real and quite intense, and has deepened over the last several decades. And as much as mobility continues, and we have vehicles for it, it's important that we also look at the ways in which we stay in place. So that's one of the things that I've been interested in understanding, is how class gets reproduced over time from generation to generation, how we often have these different kinds of class leanings. Now, to understand class, it's tricky. It's very messy. And one of the reasons why it's tricky is because most of us, when you ask us what class we belong to, we say we're middle class. And again, that idea that we're all middle class may be a set of virtues that we all embrace. We embrace middle class values, perhaps, but it often obscures how somebody whose salary is quite substantial relative to somebody's salary that's quite small, that they're both middle class. And so that makes it very difficult for us to sort of think through class. Now, we can think about class in these really tangible ways, the economics of class. Sociologists, we talk about what's called SES, so socioeconomic status, and we look at things like education, occupation, income. Right. Well, so that's about sort of resources, right? And so we can think about that class in that way, and indeed that the economics of class profoundly shapes our lives. It shapes the likelihood of whether or not we'll marry. We live in a cultural moment where marriage is, well, there's a big marriage gap, so that lower income folks just aren't marrying at the same rates that middle class and college educated folks are marrying, and with real consequences on communities, right? And then there's these other aspects of class which are sort of more cultural in form that are linked to the economics, but they have to do with things like taste, not only how many books we have, but the books that we read, what newspaper we read. Do we read USA Today or New York Times? The range of social tastes. You can see it in the expression of food. Do we eat fish sticks or sushi? You can see it in the ways in which people dress. You can see it in the kinds of music that they can form. Now, we live in a moment where we also embrace openness and accessibility, and so we aren't so tied to particular ways, right? So that ideas of like highbrow culture or lowbrow culture have kind of been disrupted. And now when we talk about middle class folks, they talk about the range of tastes that they have. Sociologists call them cultural omnivores. They consume broadly, although they tend not to listen to country music, which I find very interesting. But they do listen to the range of other kinds of musical forms. The reason why this is meaningful is that these kinds of cultural ways of being, not just sort of the economic aspects, have consequences as people move into different kinds of social settings, consumer spaces. Schools, which is where my research has mostly been, is one of those places where not just the economics of social life, but the kind of cultural dimensions of class profoundly impact the experiences of young people. The thing is that school institutions are mostly middle-class institutions. The teachers and administrators that run them are mostly middle class. And that's great if just the students are coming in are middle class, but if they're not, there's often a mismatch between their expectations about how a student would comport themselves, how they might speak, and what the student is actually doing. And this creates a profound gulf for those students, and often for the teachers who struggle to understand, how do I reach this kid? My toolkit to reach them, well, I don't know how to do it. And so we have lots of moments of conflict and confusion over how to work across the great gulf of class. Now, one of the things that's meaningful is that when we talk about class, we often talk about it in terms of disadvantage. And so we know a lot more about poor folks and working class folks, and we don't know that much, relatively, about upper income folks, the educated folks. Their worlds are all around us. Every time, my husband always makes a joke, every time we turn on the TV, he's like, another wealthy family. How is it that they're all wealthy? Right? And of course they're not, but that is sort of the normal worldview that we're presented with. But it remains in some sense invisible to us at the same time. And the consequence is that it becomes very, very difficult for upper income people, professionals, to see the ways in which class is a part of their lives, too. It's really hard to name. We sort of know it when we're in the presence of it, but it's hard for us to name it. And part of that is because we don't always have the tools to recognize that. Sociologists have been thinking about this for a while, so they've sort of begun to develop some good tools that I find are very useful in thinking about how class works as young people move into different institutional settings, schools in particular. The struggles of working class mothers and fathers who care deeply about education, who go into the school but aren't quite sure how to talk to the teacher because they feel perhaps as though they're outsiders to that school context, as though they might say the wrong thing or not sound smart enough. And so they leave, and the teacher's left with the impression that the parents don't care that much about school or their child doing well in school, when in fact they really do. They just don't have the tools necessarily to bridge that great gulf. And the teacher doesn't either. And schools of ed have done a great job of trying to communicate some of those lessons to young teachers so that they understand that kids learn in contexts, right? And that there's histories that they bring with them. But then there's also these sort of enduring ideas that prevail, right? That we think that lower income families don't care about education, even though we know, based on the surveys that we've conducted with them, that they really do. They care the same amount. They may not have the tools to fully access it as easily. And so that ends up shaping their experiences in it. Now, I had said that middle class and upper income, and when I say middle class, it's sort of this bizarre category, because am I talking about professional middle class, folks college educated, folks who have some amount of higher education, or am I talking about civil servants who were postal workers and have been able to secure employment but perhaps didn't have the benefits of going to college, but were able to find a sustainable life other ways. So it's sort of tricky. But when I talk about middle class, in this context, I'm mostly talking about upper middle class folks and the tools that we have to think about the means to evaluate our own lives and our interactions with the range of folks that we come into contact with, the kinds of investments and values that we attempt to transmit to our children, but the kinds of values that we bring to parenting, for example. Social scientists, we know that class matters to how people parent, right? That upper income professional parents embrace a set of practices around developing the child, cultivating that child's special talents. And so those children spend lots and lots of time in organized activities. Parents seize opportunities for their children to learn all the time, for better, for worse. And that we know that working class families embrace a model of parenting rooted in love, but maybe gives kids a little more freedom. Sociologists call this the accomplishment of natural growth, right? Give some boundaries to the kids, let the kids go out and explore on their own. And they cultivate a different skill set, but that skill set doesn't always work as they move into schools. And so they are in lots of ways set up to struggle in schools. And absent the resources to deal with it, it makes it very difficult for us. And the consequence is that the kids who are prepared to operate in that institution move through that institution with relative ease. They might have some bumps along the road. Every once in a while you get a teacher where you just don't connect, right? Those SAT scores, they're a real struggle. But folks mostly get to sort of move through with relative ease. And then other kids, by the time they've gotten to the end, they think about school as this place they just want to get out of, right? And so school is no longer a vehicle for them toward mobility. It's closed off for them. We could do more as a society to think through these very subtle, everyday ways that inequality creeps in to our lives as we move through these different kinds of institutional settings. I'll stop there. I hope folks will have some questions.
Thank you. And Mark Jefferson.
How's everybody doing? I have a confession. I love Martin Luther King Day. Yeah. But maybe not for the reasons that many of you all would surmise. I enjoy seeing how we talk about the dream, right? There's always the dream, whether it's a commercial to sell cars or to sell, or to clean your house or something. There's always something about this dream. One of the issues I have as a scholar, as an African American who tries to think deeply about the tradition that formed him, is that that dream was not the full summation of his message. Contrary to popular myth, this dream was not the full summation of Dr. King's message. As we've come to see his life evolve from 1963 to his death in 1968, we saw a Martin Luther King become more radical in his political and economic stances. So the Martin Luther King that gained all the acclaim in the Nobel Peace Prize, that figure of Martin Luther King began to go through this metamorphosis as he began to understand the importance of class. Nothing shakes up your financial base like talking about class. Because in order for him and others in the civil rights movement to be able to fund and to be able to finance this enterprise of justice and equality, there were many people of significant means who were able to lend their support and their resources to be able to bring this into fruition. But what happens when your message becomes more radical than your support? His conundrum was not a conundrum only for his life, but W.E.B. Du Bois, the noted sociologist, he started out with this notion of carving out a talented tenth, this African-American leadership class. It's a class of elite teachers, lawyers, doctors, professionals who would lift up the race of African-Americans in the eyes of white middle-class America. But even in Du Bois's life, as he got older, he realized race wasn't really the critical issue. Race was part of a braided reality in which race, class, gender, sexism, and all these forces began to interlock into a system of being. So the same upper middle class people that Du Bois sought to buoy with his intellect, the ones he sought to advocate for, turned their back on him later in life. Why? Because he began to understand there's something funny with the money. Martin Luther King in 1967, at a speech at Stanford University entitled The Other America, he discussed what it was like to be African American. But African American also meant this sense of poverty, this sense of class struggle, that we were removed from what it meant to be American. So he's bringing the reality of what it meant to be poor to the minds of those who may have never had that context. It would seem oxymoronic to talk about poverty, right? We see it every day. Our society is indexed by poverty, those who have and those who don't have, and then the mental sociological space of us finding this middle ground. Because middle class in many ways is an ideological perspective. But when many of us check our bank accounts, there's not much middle for some of us. And for those who have plenty, there is a deep shame about what class does. So for me, the issue tonight isn't class. The issue for me is the silence around class. Class is this America's secret shame, because our country was founded by financial speculators and religious folks. New York City was a trading hub. It wasn't meant as a missionary outpost for altruism. It was made to make a buck. People began to push through from coast to coast in America. They began to consume land and resources. Why? Because this was an economic venture that had moral implications. Let us not be fooled. America is a class-based system. in which race helps to calcify how this system stays intact. So as a preacher, as someone who teaches preaching, I've taught preaching at 4 different institutions. I've taught preaching to graduate students for 6, 7 years now. The silence that I'm finding about class is what's troubling me. The fact that people won't speak complicated truths because class is in the biblical text. But our notion of class, our shame of class, our ways of not dealing with class influence how we even interpret the biblical text. So our silence is in many ways killing us. Our inability to discuss why class makes us uncomfortable, the way that we use code words to shade meaning so that we don't have to confront what it means to be in a class-based society in which some people, by the virtue of how they're categorized, will never have a fair shake. Reinhold Niebuhr says in his book, Moral Man and Moral Society, that people have a private morality. They have a morality of how they feel about themselves and how the world should work, but then how human beings in a group function are a different entity. There seems to be this imaginative gap between how the world really works and how we imagine that it works. Someone has to pick the fruit. Someone has to do the labor, but because the way our society is organized in terms of economics, we don't see who does the labor. We get the output of the labor. So those who are engaged in the class struggle of unionizing and trying to have rights and equal pay, we don't see their struggle because all we see is the product of their labor. Their invisibility leads to silence. Some of us, we are ashamed of our own stories of class. Some of us have had, some of us have, some of us don't have. Some of us are aspiring to attain, some of us have no desire to attain at all. But each of us have a story and a testimony about what class has done for them. How it has shaped you, how it has informed you, how you see God through your framework of class. Because your theological concept is tied to your idea of your class concept. Some people couldn't understand having a God who was black because that is antithetical to their class concept. So I hope what we do today, I hope the opportunity that we take if we're serious about trying to get to the root of what's happening in our society. This election was an election about a lot of things, but it was an election about class. I preached in places in Ohio that were burned out with heroin because the mill left in 1976 and never came back. I preached in these places. I saw these things. And so many of us who have been removed from what it's like to be the average American are now being reacquainted because this class dialogue is pressing itself upon our national consciousness. As Christians, as ministers of reconciliation, as the Bible will call some of us, it is our responsibility, it is our call, it is my plea that we begin to blow the trumpet, to talk about the issues that really divide us. And primarily that issue is class.
Thank you all. So my first question is back to the three of you. Is there something that you heard from each other about which you would like to just respond, speak gratitude? Is there something that needs to be reaffirmed or translated into your context before we open it up to the wider audience?
May I launch out?
Sure. I have a comment, but you
Good.
go first.
Launch
Okay.
and then comment.
Yeah.
All right. Part of the silence that I see around class stems from shame. But I want us to understand how deep class is. Class even becomes biological.
That's right.
What you can afford to eat. Can you take care of yourself? Can you go to the doctor? Now class then orders the choices that we make in terms of who we marry, the type of children we have, how many children we have. So now this idea of class has then taken a biological and material form, so that class is reproducing in us all the while. So it could be really that our body politic could be dying slowly from this infection of class that really is changing the way that we live together. And so between the sociological approach, the theological approach, the homiletic approach, you're starting to see how this notion of class is this really tightly knitted ball that we have to begin to start untangling if we're really going to have meaningful dialogue.
Thank you.
I thought your comment about being in Ohio and looking at communities in decline was something that is just really very profound in terms of the experiences of folks from those communities who've, struggled to hold on to those communities, but have watched them wither away and usher in a whole range of social problems. You mentioned crystal meth and different kinds of drugs and poverty, and it becomes very difficult to correct that. And so I think we have lots and lots of communities like that. I can remember about 15 years ago, my father grew up in the Rust Belt in western Pennsylvania, and I was out visiting. He went to Penn State and was one of those folks who was upwardly mobile, and I was raised in New Jersey. But I had gone out to visit my grandfather and my relatives out there, and I went to church with my grandfather, and I got to church, and I looked around, and I said, like, where are all the children, and where are all the parents? And it was folks who were 60 years and older. And the reason why that is because those folks had to leave their community. There was no work for them anymore. And this had been, at one point, a thriving community of both working folks who worked in factories and middle class and upper income folks who went to church together, who picnicked together after church, and that option was now gone. And so I think that there's these, and there's lots and lots of communities like that. Yeah.
Another comment. I think, for the last 10 years, which is my second stint of living in the U.S., there's a lot of talk of middle class. But even in the political world, no one actually talks about the poor. So my own sense is that the term class immediately comes from a Marxist analysis, right? So when we grew up, we basically talked about class and classlessness, right? And so you had this. So I'm just wondering whether there are other ways in which we can actually talk about this so that we don't get stuck where the political rhetoric is this expansive middle class, where everyone seems to feel they're in. So the upper middle class feel like, oh, this is my anxiety. The lower middle class feels anxiety. But there is a certain fragile class. There is, and so I find the work of Amartya Sen that talks a lot about the capabilities approach. So this is basically what actually are capacities and capabilities that one has and does not have. And how do you... So I'm just wondering whether the language of class reminds everyone of Karl Marx. And so the fear that, in fact, when you talk about that, then that you're going to talk about a classless society, or, we have to dismantle classes. And so there's some, and you could see even in my talk, I was running away from class because if I go back to it, my early Marxism will come back, right? So then I look for dishonor, other categories in which we look at this.
It is okay if you ask a question. I just wanted a small world thing. I grew up in North London in England, and I grew up about 10 blocks from the cemetery where Karl Marx's tomb is. And one of the sort of kid things that we used to do is we'd go visit the cemetery and play tag in the cemetery. But the regular there was this kind of regular tradition of his head being blown off his tomb and being on the ground. And so it was always sort of like, well, is it on the ground today or is it back on the statue? But the interesting thing is the kids that I was playing tag, with whom I was playing tag, were the most economically diverse group of children that I've ever known. And because we knew each other because of our neighborhood. And this is the British system, which talks a little more explicitly about class than the American system. But we went to all different schools, and we had very different economic stability in our lives. But we found each other in the village square, and we just became fast friends. And it was over the years of beginning to talk with each other that I actually began to understand some of the significance of the silence around financial and economic privilege and the access issues. So when I wanted to play with one of those friends and discovered they didn't have a telephone at their house, I either had to walk to the house and knock on the door, or one summer when I was sick in bed, which was very rare, I had to write a letter which was posted to the friend to ask the friend to come play. And there was this whole sense that I was awakening to, what I had taken for granted, which was the telephone or having a car. And all of a sudden, this group of friends, as we became teenagers, all we had in common was the outdoors, the public transit system, and the sense that, we were always hungry at the same time. And we would figure out, where could we get something free to eat? And we were very creative and very innovative about that. But it was very interesting. It was in the shadow of Karl Marx and this whole classless society and the threat that was to the British Empire. And we lived sort of right there with the dust under our feet. It's very fun. So, John, would you like to ask a question? Let me give you a microphone so that... Well, actually, we need you to because there's people online, and they will not be able to hear you.
All right. Okay, well, thank you.
So you have to hold it near your mouth.
And
That's how they work.
I am going to basically make a statement, and we'll see if there's a question in it. Especially directed to you, Mark. There's a couple of things going on here. First of all, I did actually come here for the very first time with the idea that I was going to understand the idea of class in church. That's the title of the workshop. And so I assumed, basically being a Bible study person that I am, that we were going to sort of go through the scriptures and sort of describe how the class is defined in the scripture. Now, two of you did refer to this, and that's a good thing. I'm not trying to force the change in the agenda. You've already made your presentations. But what I want to say is that I know, based on what I understand about the scripture and about the ministry of Jesus, that he was certainly trying to make sure that he was not seeing those kinds of class differences. He was basically, he says, I come here, to the poor and to those that are unfranchised and in being unjustly treated in the society, because they're the ones who need me. And you referred to this, that this is where Jesus is found. He's found in the poor and in those that are struggling in this life. Those are the ones that are basically reaching out to him, primarily.
Can you bring this to a question?
Well, I haven't even actually got through it yet. What I wanted to do was, this is, I guess, the question. The question is, we've just gone through a very, very terrible campaign and election season. And a lot of that, we now know, has a lot to do with class. This is what's really dividing America right now, more than just about anything else. And you made this very important point, which is that whatever class you identify with it in sort of your own mythological way, because the reality of your situation might not have anything to do with it.
So that's all true, and you want him to address?
What I'm trying to say is that Obama tried to straighten out a lot of what the concerns were with reaching out to the underclass. And it was not recognized by what we might think of a primarily as the working class, middle class, that have their own concept of what they believed was going to happen to them. And it seems to me that the Democrats should have approached this problem from this concern about trying to rectify class in race rather than anything else, and they would have resolved the problem.
Thank you.
So to that, part of what I detected in this election wasn't anything new, right? When we talk about working class issues, the working class, the image that snaps into your mind is white. You're thinking coal miners, you're thinking, right? So when we say working class, there's a particular image that it brings to mind. Why? Because this is the voter base you need to turn out. So trying to overlay kind of political rhetoric with kind of the reality of things can be messy. So let's try to pull those apart. So and I won't even say this is a Democrat or Republican thing. What I will say is that historically our society, that many of the race struggles our society has had has been because of economic issues. So race riots, as the Great Migration, African Americans began to leave the South en masse in the early 20th century. Many of the race riots you found were many white workers who found their jobs threatened by this emerging black working class. So many of these white industries were coming to the South, recruiting cheaper labor, telling them to come to the city, we'll take care of you. And then you have this swell of labor, which then drives the price down, but then which drives labor down so that then you can have a struggle for labor. So then we'll call this a race riot, when in actuality it is a more complex issue than race. It is race and labor. So what you find throughout American history is that elites have always tried to split black and white working class people. Always. Because that's good business. But then what you find are that people actually buy into these differences in such a way in which they can never reconcile their common humanity. And so even in this election, if we take the 99% understanding to be true, that most of us, at the end of the day, are lumped into most of us don't have. Only 0.5% really have the lion's share of things. So if that is true, why are the 99% of us arguing about who doesn't have, when the majority of us don't have? So that means that the political rhetoric we've imbibed has then really done a work on our imagination to see our common humanity. And I think that's really the issue, for us to really think deeply about how do we stitch together our common humanity so we're able to work together.
Can I add?
Please.
There's a relatively new book by Arlie Hochschild, who's a sociologist who wrote a book, Strangers in Their Own Land, and it's based upon 5 years of immersing herself in communities in Louisiana, and the bulk of whom would not necessarily have voted for Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. And what she found is a similar thing that you're identifying, this imagination. She calls it the deep story, which is this idea that it's a set of events as if, that these things. And what she found in befriending the range of folks is that economically they're on very shaky ground, that they're quite socially marginalized, that the system of race, which is not a functioning system, although it is improved, that they've largely been blamed for it, and that they're observing a set of demographic changes that they're not quite sure what to make of it. But they know that as those demographic changes are occurring, they've also lost ground. Now, they've lost ground for different reasons that have to do with changes in our economy and its consequence for those communities. But it's occurring at a particular time where those changes are, and that shapes this deep story that then motivates particular kinds of political action and a deep distrust in government. So that where some folks might think of government as a way to address social problems, other folks don't. They really see government as actually responsible for them. And so anyway, but it's a very nice book, Strangers in Their Own Land.
I just want to make a comment that there's a remarkable number of new titles that people are reading across this country that speak to this issue, and I find that very hopeful. So the popularity of Hillbilly Elegy, the popularity of White Trash, a number of books that are speaking particularly to those of us from the dominant culture for whom this issue has been somewhat removed from our fairly protected upper middle class lives for too long. There is the urgency of our times. I think a positive outcome of this election season is that people are paying attention. We are awakening to the seriousness of the divisions in our country, and the resources are available to us to begin to respond as informed citizens, as well as Christian people who are called to reconcile a world that was never intended to be divided. Question in the back. Please tell us who you are, and then ask.
My name is Cheryl Chevalier. For a number of years, I was a professor of education, and I worked many hours, many days, working with student teachers in the classroom. And so it meant I went into all kinds of classrooms, city classrooms, charter classrooms. Oh, okay. Should I start over? Okay. My name is Cheryl Chevalier. I was a professor of education for a number of years, and I spent a lot of time in the schools, city schools, country schools, village schools, charter schools. And the thing that keeps coming to my mind as I'm listening to us speak tonight is the power of culture. And every time I would go into another school, I'd have to learn that culture, walk with those people, and develop an anthropological approach to the people that I was working with, the teachers and the students. And as we're talking, I don't even know exactly what my question is, but it seems as though culture is big. Maybe it's even bigger than class. I know that this is in the 1970s, during the desegregation of the schools, Shirley Bryce Heath did this powerful ethnographic work in North Carolina, the Piedmonts. And she found that the white and black working professional class were very close in how they parented, in how they worked with writing. That writing was what really distinguished the class, upper classes from the lower classes economically. And she found that there was a distinct difference in white working class and black working class. White working class, the children were taught to be very literal, to tell the truth. Black children were taught to lie, but not in the sense of lying, but telling a good story and being very creative in their stories. So when the black children went to school, the schools were very literal. The white children did very well. The black children had trouble because they wanted to move. You go to a black church and you're moving all the time. You go to a white church and you sit very still. And so the white children started out with an advantage that the black children didn't have. But as the children grew older, the black children were better with the older expectations because they were better at inferencing. And the white children fell behind because they were being literal. But by the time the black children got to those upper grades, they'd already lost out on so many skills. So a lot of that inequality in class was happening just at that point. And I was talking to a gentleman on the bus, African-American gentleman on the bus, and he said, somebody came to church, and he was a speaker at their church, asked, how do you know which children are going to be in prison? And the answer is their third grade reading ability. And so it seems to me that I think, so this is starting to sound professorial, but but culture just keeps popping out at me when we're talking.
Well, and I'm sitting with a sociologist, but your culture is one of those terms that it can be the macro defining term, or it can be of which class then becomes a significant subset, or it can, it's a composite concept. But part of what you're talking about is this notion of intersectionality, that when we weave race, class, gender, body, ability, and so forth together, we create sort of algorithms that become even more complex, and sort of exponential levels of oppression or vulnerability can be formed without even knowing it. So that when we interweave particularly race and class, we create a particularly vulnerable posture in North America. But I really want to keep us on class tonight, because I think this is the issue that Mark raises about the silence. How many, just show of hands in this room, how many of you have ever been asked straightforwardly by somebody who is not your spouse or close to you how much you earn? That's about, for those of you who can't see the whole room, that's about a third of the room. How many of you have ever asked somebody else how much they earn? That's a lot fewer of us. This question about direct correlation between class and income, and you're quite right, Amy, there are so many other measures of how class is expressed, but we are silent in our churches, particularly, about real money. We have elaborate stewardship campaigns, in my experience, where we give people all sorts of formulas and suggest contributing at a certain percentage of your gross income. And then there's always is it pre-tax or post-tax, right? As if for most people who are asking that question, that would really make a difference. But we rarely, and there'll be a nice block chart that says here's an estimate. If your income ranges from this to this, this is what 10% looks like. Well, many people can chop one figure off a number and figure out 10%. It's not a conversation that we have easily. This actually engaging in what does it mean to be a real person in real time with a real bank account that has actual numbers in it. And why is that? What is it about that silence that brings up this shame? Silence because we have more than someone else has, or silence because people perceive we have more than we do, silence because we overspend. What is it about the shame that becomes a barrier to our not recognizing that we are, especially in the church, beloved children of God? Our worth and value is not related to our income or our material resources. We are indeed holy people with the capacity to do so much more when we breathe the truth into the world that we share. So, yes. Do you have does a microphone? Actually, there's one here.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
The shame that you're talking about, the same shame that you're talking about.
So I would like to complexify this a little bit.
Please do.
And this goes back to identity. So Dr. Ruth Anna Hook and I, we teach Introduction to Preaching here. Fantastic experience, wish you could take it. One of the exercises that we invited our students to engage in was laying out their identities. Who are you? Literally take a sheet of paper and describe yourself. How would you describe yourself? I'm white, I'm black, I'm this, I'm that, I'm from here, I'm from there. And what you find is that you have this interesting tapestry of identity. And depending upon the conversation, that identity will pivot and shift. So I may enter the conversation as an African-American male, but then the conversation will pivot where the Baptist part of me comes out. Right? Or it might pivot again and the scholar in me comes out, depending upon. So for many of us, the overarching identity of who we see ourselves to be puts us then in responsibility or in relationship to our neighbor. So the question becomes, how do we understand ourselves? So this shame I'm talking about deals with not being able to be fully in touch with all the identities that make me who I am. We've made money a virtue. And then if money becomes a virtue, if wealth becomes a virtue, it's an unexplainable virtue. Because then you have to explain, how much money do I make? Was this money inherited? Did I come from wealth? Now this virtue that has been bestowed upon me, I cannot explain it, therefore what do? I don't talk about it. Or I don't have it and then I'm silent because I can't explain to you why I don't. And then it takes on theological shape because then we say, blessed are the poor, right? So this theological identity formation piece, they seem to clash because depending upon how we see ourselves at the time, and typically class is typically the way that we frame ourselves to other people, how we dress, where we drive, where we live. All those things begin to form ways in which we see ourselves. And if
And
we
to
don't
what
take
extent do we see ourselves the way people are projecting their expectations on us and are
Exactly.
labeling us? Right.
Can I just
Yes,
add
Amy.
to that? In terms of the shame component, I mean, one of the things that I think about is how class operates on this psychosocial level. And so there's this material aspect of class, like, can you pay your mortgage payment kind of thing, or are you renting? But then there's this kind of psychosocial component. And a wonderful book that was written actually several decades ago now called The Hidden Injuries of Class detailed how class becomes this sort of aspect of ourselves. And they were particularly interested in understanding the experiences of working class folks and the shame that surrounds that and the deep ambivalence. And one of the things that I'm often struck by is for folks who are upwardly mobile, who leave the class behind that they were from and move into a new class, they often feel a deep sense of distance and ambivalence about their origins, which is about who they are and the people that had raised them. And so, sometimes you'll hear things like, you can't go home. And then in a racial context, we'll often hear things like, sort of the importance of representing and going back. And it is an effort to address how shame, these sorts of very social things that appear to be just operating on the surface actually become very much a part of us.
Yes, I have a question right here.
Yes. I have really appreciated what you all have had to say this evening. I'm wondering, is there a gender difference that happens in how people talk about class? My personal experience is that there is, but I would appreciate hearing from you.
Good question. Thank you, Melanie.
I mean, I think historically when we think about the working class and sort of claiming working class identity, it was mostly men, because we used to associate being working class with union jobs, and women were not included in unions. And it was a mark of pride to be, a union man. And that changed we don't have unions in quite the same way, so it looks very different. But I think that the experience of class is highly gendered. And if you think about in terms of, because class operates in this moral level too, where we assign value to people, and in terms of, sort of respectable women versus not respectable women, that often gets divided up in these very specific class ways. We have historically over the century defined respectable women as being middle-class women. We define femininity by soft hands, but
And good teeth.
Right, and good teeth, but women who, worked in farms, their hands wouldn't necessarily be soft, so somehow they were excluded from those categories. And so I think gender has profoundly shaped the experience of class.
I think also by not giving accurate accounting to the experiences of women of many different cultural and racial designations, it weakens the ability for us to have true social transformation. Because to make this a masculine issue or an issue that concerns only men really circumvents the fullness of the issue. Because typically if men are out working these jobs and someone is home, right, taking care of said child, said children, but many women are out here working and doing. But if their voice, just like in church, if their voice is truncated from the major decision-making policies and practices, then you're not going to have a well-rounded approach to making systemic good. Mm-hmm.
The comment is that she thinks we also talk about it differently. We definitely have, I think that there's a very gendered language of class that is very particular, and also social patterns of conversation are very gendered, right? So there's a question over here, and then I'll bring the microphone to the back. Would you say who you are, please?
Elliot Waters.
Thank you.
And I'm a 2001 graduate from VTS, and one of the things that I recall very fondly here is my having a tendency to ask my professors from time to time, given my background, my former background as a military person and treasuring the importance of teaching, how are we teaching these students, and to include myself, how to love one another. Now, that's not my question here.
All right.
But given the context of baptism and what it is supposed to mean, help me understand how class fits into the construct of our understanding what baptism should be.
Sati?
I gave you a personal story of transformation and how I'm reclaiming my baptism. Of course, I didn't make any vows because I was a child, but what happened and what I'm willing to do. I think this is a major issue for theological formation. We can preach an excellent sermon on baptism, but we do not know how to use the spaces within our church to reconfigure relationships that break down privilege, a system of honor, and a system of class. And this is something that we have been struggling with. How do you get people to learn that this is part and parcel of their everyday practice? Having said this, I think that there's no better place than the church than to actually do this. Again, let me give you another story. In November, Lisa and Trish know where we worship, so I facilitate a Bible study among homeless at the Church of the Epiphany. So there are about 12 people to 15 people. It's wonderfully boisterous and creative, right? So November, first Sunday was my turn, and I go in there, about 11 or 12 homeless, and then a 13th or 14th, I didn't count them, a gentleman sitting there, and we all read the Bible together. And my fear, because I knew who the gentleman was that the friends who are homeless will take this gentleman on. It was Rowan Williams. Now, Rowan Williams...
Just for a moment, Rowan Williams, for those of you who may not be Episcopalian, is the retired Archbishop of Canterbury of the Anglican Communion. So he is...
And he's the master of Magdalen House at Cambridge University, right? So if you can have a church community in which the person that is going to preach at 8 o'clock feels that there is a way of preparation to lift up the word, to be with the communities that are dishonored by all of us, I thought to myself, this is a platform of hope that we haven't utilized sufficiently in terms of what we do. So I think this constant relearning what it means, not just for us individually, but how one then dismantles the structure. Again, we have the great privilege of also listening to preaching, forming preaching, what happens in terms of the pulpits. I think that's another very interesting place in which we lift up the responsibility of churches to break down all that we know that Jesus actually was about in terms of dismantling. So I would say that this is something that, and I see that this is really much more important for us in terms of the voice of the church. Because, there's a comment made a lot about whether it's class or culture, right? So to get away from Karl Marx, Antonio Gramsci introduced a very interesting concept. We know this, the concept of cultural hegemony.
Yeah.
That is, he basically said Marx was slightly off because he put everything in terms of relationships
Dialectic.
of production, right? He was talking about material production and what happens and the distance between those who were producing and the labor and those that in fact couldn't consume that which they were making, right? Now, Gramsci actually said, you cannot hold the system together if you don't actually weave a culture, a shallow story, but is very deep, right? Where the people that are actually being marginalized participate in the larger cultural hegemonic story and give themselves fully to it, right? And I'd say a lot of what's happened within the election rhetoric and a lot of people that feel let down in terms of why certain people that knew that it was not in their interest were willing to go both sides, right? But this is because of the fact that the people that in fact belong to the elite class that function in a way of ownership are also able to produce knowledge and cultural stories. Now, it's in this context that we're asked to work within our churches to weave a counter-hegemonic story. And I think really the next few years will be crucial to the role of the church, whether indeed we are called to be the community that lives by the baptismal covenant, or in fact, we just are part of also manufacturing lots of cotton candy saying that this is real food.
Right.
May I?
Thank you. That was there's a question in the back, and then, Mark, do you want to say your comment before the question?
Before we go.
Yeah.
As a professor of preaching, since we're all family, I'll share with you, right? As a professor of preaching, I take seriously the times in which we're in. And I stress to my students that if you call yourself a preacher, this is the time to preach. And not just to preach what you've heard your whole life and just kind of put a new spin on it. But God is asking us to do something new theologically in light of our knowledge of our current situation. So it's not just to preach more beautiful sermons, but it's sermons that get to the critical heart of what's really happening in the world. So the silence that we see in the pulpit, the silence that we see by preachers, and the silence that we see in our general public, they're all interconnected. And so my hope is that each one of you will begin to cultivate your story of faith and how class has impinged upon your life, so that people can begin to see that woe is you, a person of unclean lips, but God is using you to still put forth a prophetic message of what God can do in the world. So take inventory of yourself, but know that God is empowering you to make change in spite of your situation.
And that I also think as an incarnate being in the world, we can witness to that change in nonverbal ways too. So one of the great barriers in our churches may be how the people in our churches dress. I've heard people say, I don't feel welcome at that church because I don't have the right clothes.
Yeah.
I don't feel welcome at that church because I wouldn't park my car anywhere near that parking lot. I don't feel welcome at that church because, I can't afford braces for my children. Those kinds of nonverbal, embedded messages about our beliefs, our values, our understanding of ourselves as people of worth and value are critical and contrary to the gospel that we proclaim. Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Davis. I'm an aspiring Christian from Emmanuel Church on the Hill. I grew up in East Tennessee to a middle-class family, but less than 10 miles away from Appalachia, where a family of four makes a median income of about $4,000 a year. And I can remember back in 1969 being in kindergarten. Behind other things, our kindergarten was the first integrated one in the state of Tennessee. And we did the thing where you go around the room and, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I still remember this to that day, so few days ago, because there were kids in the classroom, white kids as well as black kids, whose answer was draw. I had no idea what they were talking about. I went home and asked my mom, and I said, what do they mean by draw? And she means draw welfare. These are 5-year-old kids, and they've already decided their wealth in life is to draw. And the church would go out in the community, and as we saw recently from the terrible fires, the South does maintain that sense of community in the fact that we take care of our own. But one of the things I see and hear about now is because class has become so ingrained that there's almost a fear to leave your class because you have to leave generations of a family behind. I mean, when you've got families that have drawn welfare ever since it came out, and you are being encouraged to get beyond it, you're considered a traitor because you're standing. And that's one thing I see my church back in Tennessee, which is confronting now. The handouts are more than welcome, but the attempts to cross the class lines, especially from those of us who are blessed socially and economically, are seen as intrusions, almost with a violent anger at times. And I was wondering, how can those of us who have been blessed, and I got to tell you, up north I find it even more so. Being nice to people up here is often perceived as having an ulterior motive. And for someone who was raised in the South, it was quite a culture shock. So I'd love to hear y'all's feedback on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone want to say?
So I thank you so much for your insightful comments. And I was thinking about Sathi's comment about cultural hegemony, and part of what makes cultural hegemony work is when it's resonant. Mm-hmm. And if it's not resonant, it doesn't quite work so well. And but I think your point speaks to a couple different things. One is this sort of practice of deep listening. Mm-hmm. And then the other is these spaces where folks are like differently valued. I've worked with a nonprofit based in Alexandria that deals, they do work on food access issues so that they sell sustainable, locally grown food in various parts of DC and actually in parts of South Fairfax County. And what's so interesting about these markets is that they bring together folks across income groups, and they have been wonderfully successful. And I was asked to do a program evaluation for them, which was to try and figure out why they've been so successful. And one of the things that became very, very clear is that folks would come. Some people would use their EBT cards, which are basically food stamps. Other people would pay in cash, their senior vouchers. And the folks who worked there facilitated a kind of reciprocal exchange where the people who are using their EBT were asked how they're going to prepare those foods. How do you do that? How do you make your ham hocks? How do you use your okra? And so there was a real valuing of cultural ways of life rather than this assumption of going in and fixing. Mm-hmm. And I think that requires a kind of deep listening, so that it's not so much about changing them, but honoring the family structure, for example, as the sort of center of life, and thinking about ways to connect that way.
The church has been a place that has formed its constituents to be cultural missionaries, not just theological missionaries. So we didn't just go and tell people about the goodness of Jesus. Theological education, whether it was in seminaries or in individual churches, we went out to make people in terms of moral formation. Mm-hmm. So it's the formation of morality and class that we call religion. So we were making people over in a middle class way, not making them over in the ways of Jesus per se. We made them over in the ways in which we were made.
In our own image. Mm-hmm.
And so as we try to make people in our own image, we might find that way of modeling discipleship is breaking down. And God is asking us to do something far more vulnerable than going and giving and hoping that they like us. God is inviting us into a space that may be far more uncomfortable.
I'm going to invite Sati to make a last comment, and then I have a closing prayer, and none of us are going anywhere in a hurry. There are still refreshments across the hall, and if you have a question that was not raised publicly and you would like to bring it to one of us, we would be glad to receive it. So, Sati.
I think this, both of you really helped me to articulate this, which I think is important for us to keep in mind. That when we talk about class and we think about the fragile classes or the poor, it's very important to keep in mind that they're not just victims, but they have amazing imagination in terms of working themselves out of very, very difficult situations.
Mm-hmm. And resilience.
Resilience, but also imagination about what they should do in that particular situation. In fact, there's a really excellent book called Poor Economics. It's by Banerjee and Duflo. And basically, it's case studies across the world about the imagination of the poor of working themselves out of poverty. So I think even while we talk about this, to keep in mind that there are amazing resources. So even while you are usually swept off your feet, thinking and listening to sage imagination and sage representation, there's also self-representation of the poor that is amazingly imaginative. The second is also, we shouldn't forget, if we belong to a global community, the privilege of class appears very differently for us in the US. And that's something one should keep in mind. The stark reality of abject poverty across the world in the family of God is very different. And so I think even while we talk about issues at home, it's important to see what's happening around the world. And I say this because of the penchant of discourse over the last year, which tends to basically think that we have to extricate ourselves from globalization and focus only on the local.
Right.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that we all belong together to one common human race.
Amen. Thank you three so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A prayer from Reinhold Niebuhr. O God, we pray for all sorts and conditions of people, for all who toil in the burden and heat of the day, that they may enjoy the rewards of their industry, that they may not be defrauded of their due, and that we may never cease to be mindful of our debt to them for making our life tolerable. For those in authority who have power over others, that they may not use it for selfish advantage, but be guided to do justice and love mercy. For those who have been worsted in the battles of life, whether by the inhumanity of others, their own limitations, or the fickleness of fortune, that they may contend against injustice without bitterness and learn how to accept what cannot be altered with patience. For the rulers of nations, that they may promote peace among the peoples and establish justice in our common life. For the teachers and ministers of your power, for artists, scientists, and interpreters of the spiritual life, that they may not corrupt the truth to which they are committed. For prophets and seers who awaken us from our sloth, that they may hold their torches high in a world darkened by prejudice. O God, who has bound us together in this bundle of life, give us the grace to understand how our lives depend on one another and our responsibilities to you. Amen.